The day Cora Wallace rode into Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory, the whole town stopped breathing for a moment, not because a woman arriving alone on horseback was entirely unheard of in 1879, but because she wore the kind of expression that dared any man to ask her what she was doing there. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned back beneath a practical wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of winter sage gray with just enough green in them to make a man uncertain. Her dress was trail-worn but clean. Her boots were cracked along the left heel, and the saddlebag draped across her mare's hindquarters was packed so tightly that the leather seemed strained with every step. She had ridden 3 days from Cheyenne, slept under open sky twice, and eaten nothing since yesterday morning except a strip of dried jerky and half a tin of peaches she had been rationing since Laramie. But none of that showed on her face. What showed on her face was purpose. Dry Creek sat at the base of the Wind River Range, a scrappy little settlement of maybe 200 souls that had sprung up around a silver claim 5 years prior. The silver had mostly played out by now, but the town had stubbornly refused to die the way so many mining towns did, partly because a trading post had taken root here, and partly because the surrounding valley land was good enough for cattle, and the ranchers had moved in to fill the silence the miners left behind. There were 2 saloons, a livery stable, a general store, a sheriff's office that looked as though it might blow over in a stiff wind, a church that had never been finished, and a scattering of homes and businesses that radiated outward from the main street like the spokes of a wheel that hadn't quite been assembled correctly. Cora knew all of this because she had spent the last 2 months in Cheyenne studying maps, reading land records that she had requested from territorial offices, and writing letters that mostly went unanswered. She knew Dry Creek the way you know a place you have never been but have thought about constantly, by its shape and its reputation, but not yet by its smell or its sound or the way the late afternoon light hit the mountains behind it and turned everything amber and impossible. She pulled her mare, a steady roan she called Pepper, to a stop in front of the livery stable and climbed down with the particular grace of someone who had been riding all her life and whose body understood horses as naturally as it understood breathing. "I'm looking for a man named Garrett Sully," she said to the boy, sweeping the livery doors. He could not have been more than 16, with ears too large for his head and a wide, startled expression. "Mr. Sully," the boy said. "He runs the land office down the other end of Main Street, ma'am." "Thank you," Cora said. She handed him 2 coins. "See that my horse gets water and feed. I will be back before dark." The boy took the coins and stared after her as she walked down the center of the street with her saddlebag over one shoulder and her back as straight as the mountains behind the town. She did not make it to the land office that afternoon. What stopped her was a sign. It was nailed to the post of the general store, sun-bleached and slightly crooked, but the words on it were still perfectly legible, and those words punched the air right out of her lungs. Notice of land claim dispute. The parcel known as Wallace Creek Quarter, formerly operated by James Nathanil Wallace, is hereby declared abandoned and unclaimed as of August 1 St. 1879, PER Territorial Land Ordinance Section 14. Any prior claim must be presented in person to the Territory Land Office within 30 days of this notice or said land shall revert to open claim. August 1st. Cora read the sign twice, then a third time, her fingers pressing flat against the wooden post as though the sign might disappear if she let go of it. She pulled the small diary from her coat pocket and checked the date she had written inside the front cover when she had left Cheyenne. September 3rd, 1879. 33 days after August 1st. She was 3 days too late. Or was she? The notice said the claim must be presented within 30 days of the notice, but the notice itself had no date of posting marked on it. If the notice had gone up even a week after August 1st, she might still be within the window. She had to see Garrett Sully. She had to see him now. She was already moving when she walked straight into a wall, except the wall moved. The wall said, "Whoa," in a voice so deep it seemed to come from somewhere beneath the earth itself, and two large hands caught her by the shoulders before she could stumble backward into the dirt. Cora blinked and looked up. The man standing before her was, quite simply, the most physically overwhelming human being she had ever stood this close to. He was well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out a meaningful portion of the afternoon sky. His arms, visible below where he had rolled his flannel shirt to the elbow, were roped with muscle in a way that suggested years of genuinely hard work rather than mere size, and his hands, the ones still loosely steadying her shoulders, were scarred and calloused and enormous. He wore his dark brown hair longer than fashionable, tied back loosely at the nape of his neck with what appeared to be a piece of leather cord, and his jaw was covered in a short, dark beard that had clearly not been shaped with any particular intention, but had somehow arrived at a result that was striking rather than untidy. His eyes were dark amber, almost bronze, and they were looking at her with an expression of careful concern. "You all right?" he said. "I am perfectly fine," Cora said, stepping back from his hands with a dignity that cost her considerable effort given that her heart was hammering from the shock of colliding with him and not, she told herself firmly, for any other reason. "I apologize for walking into you. I was not paying attention." "No," he said, and he almost smiled. "You were not." He was carrying a 50-pound sack of flour under one arm as though it weighed nothing, and a bundle of steel traps slung over his other shoulder, and he studied her for a moment with that careful amber gaze before he said, "You are new. I arrived this afternoon. From the look of you, you arrived in some kind of hurry." Cora pulled herself up to her full height, which still left her looking nearly a foot upward to meet his eyes. "I need to find the land office before it closes. Do you know what time Garrett Sully shuts his doors?" Something shifted in the man's expression at the mention of Sully's name. It was subtle, barely a tightening around the jaw, but it was there. "Sully usually locks up around 5. You have maybe 40 minutes. Then I had best not waste them," Cora said, and moved to step around him. "Miss," he said, not stopping her, just speaking to the air in front of him. She paused, half-turned. "Whatever it is you are walking in to discuss with Garrett Sully," he said, "do not sign anything tonight, not until you have had time to read every word." She stared at him for a moment. "Why do you say that?" "Because Sully is the kind of man who profits most when other people are in a hurry," he said simply. Then he shifted his flour sack to his other arm, gave her a brief nod that contained more genuine respect than most men managed in full sentences, and walked on. Cora watched him for precisely 2 seconds before she turned and kept walking. The land office was at the far end of Main Street, a narrow building with green paint peeling from its door, and a small painted sign in the window that read Sully Land and Title. Inside, behind a desk covered in papers and ledgers, sat a man of about 50 with the face of someone who had been pleasant-looking once, a long time ago, but had allowed years of small ambitions and smaller scruples to rearrange his features into something shiftier. He had a thin mustache and the kind of smile that arrived a half-second too late, as though the face had to receive the message from somewhere farther away than the eyes. "Good afternoon," he said, standing with exaggerated courtesy. "Garrett Sully. How can I be of service?" "My name is Cora Wallace," she said, setting her saddlebag on the chair across from his desk and pulling out a sheaf of papers. "I am here to present a claim on the parcel known as Wallace Creek Quarter." The smile on Sully's face did not disappear exactly. It just thinned. "Miss Wallace," he said slowly. "The land belonged to my father, James Nathaniel Wallace," she said. "He filed the original homestead claim in 1871. He died in March of this year, and I am his sole legal heir. I have his death certificate, the original land grant documentation, and a letter from his attorney in Cheyenne confirming my inheritance." She laid each document on the desk as she named it, flat and deliberate, and watched Sully's eyes move across them with the expression of a man recalculating. "Miss Wallace," he said again, and now the smile was entirely gone, replaced by something that was trying to be sympathy but was really just strategy. I am afraid the notice period for contesting the abandonment claim has already. The notice on the post outside carries no date of posting, Cora said. Under territorial ordinance, a notice without a confirmed posting date cannot be used to enforce a claim lapse. I have reviewed this regulation. Section 14, paragraph 3. Sully stared at her. She stared back. I will need time to review your documents, he said finally. Of course, Cora said. I will be in town for as long as it takes. I am sure the sheriff's office can confirm my presence here and the date of my arrival if there is any question about the timeline. She picked up her bag, gathered her documents carefully back into their folder and stood. I will return tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I trust that will give you sufficient time. She left before he could respond. Outside on the boardwalk, with the last of the amber light falling long across the street, she finally let herself exhale. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed slowly until they stopped. She needed somewhere to sleep. She needed food. She needed to think. The boarding house she found on the recommendation of the livery boy was run by a woman named Mrs. Elspeth Crane, who was somewhere between 60 and ancient, had a practical, no-nonsense manner that Cora immediately respected, and asked only 3 questions. Did she have money to pay? Did she smoke indoors? Did she snore? Cora answered yes, no, and she did not believe so. She was given a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the back of the building toward the mountains. She ate supper at the long table with 3 other boarders. A traveling salesman named Perkins who talked too much. A quiet Chinese man named Mr. Lau who kept to himself and seemed to be doing accounts for someone. And a woman named Sarah Tibbs who was waiting for her husband to come back from a cattle drive and had been waiting for 6 weeks with the particular patience of someone who had stopped believing but had not yet stopped hoping. Cora listened more than she spoke, which was her habit in unfamiliar situations, and she ate everything on her plate with the focused gratitude of someone who had not had a hot meal in 3 days. She was back in her room by 8 o'clock, sitting on the narrow bed with her father's original land documents spread across the quilt, reading them again in the light of the oil lamp, the way she had read them 100 times before. Her father, James Nathaniel Wallace, had come to Wyoming Territory in 1870 with a grubstake and a determination to build something. He had filed on 200 acres along a creek that the locals called Wallace Creek after him, had built a small cabin, had started running cattle and growing what he could, and had spent 9 years scraping a life out of the mountain valley land with the kind of stubborn Scotch-Irish stubbornness that was equal parts infuriating and admirable. Cora's mother had died when Cora was 7, and her father had raised her himself for 3 years before sending her east to live with her aunt in Cincinnati, where she could go to school and have a settled life. She had seen him summers when she could, and they had written letters faithfully every month until his handwriting began to change in the letters from early 1879, growing shaky and then sparse. And then in March, a stranger had written to tell her that James Wallace had died of pneumonia, alone in his cabin, in a February cold snap. She had taken 2 months to settle what she could in Cincinnati, and then she had come west to claim what was rightfully hers, and in doing so to claim the name that had been scraped into this land by her father's bare hands. Wallace Creek Quarter, her land, her name, her right. She fell asleep with the documents still spread across the quilt and dreamed of mountains. The next morning she rose at 6, washed her face in the basin, put on her best remaining clean blouse, and went downstairs to find coffee and bread and whatever resolve she could assemble before 9 o'clock. What she found in the kitchen, seated at the table with a mug of coffee and a plate of Mrs. Crane's cornbread, was the mountain man from yesterday. He looked up when she entered, and she had a moment to register that he looked somewhat different in the morning light, less overwhelming than he had seemed on the street, or perhaps she had simply adjusted her sense of scale. He had washed his face and his hair was still slightly damp, and he had removed his coat, and the flannel shirt he wore did nothing whatsoever to minimize the breadth of his shoulders or the suggestion of considerable strength beneath it. His amber eyes held a kind of quiet alertness that she recognized as belonging to men who spent most of their time in wilderness and had learned to notice everything. "Miss Wallace," he said, with that brief nod that she was beginning to understand was his version of more elaborate greeting. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. "You know my name." "Dry Creek is small," he said. "You were the topic of conversation in both saloons by 8 o'clock last night." "Wonderful," Cora said dryly and moved to pour herself coffee from the pot on the stove. "Elias Holloway," he said. She turned. He was looking at her steadily. "My name, since we have already collided once and are apparently sharing a breakfast table." "Elias Holloway," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "Mountain man, I take it, from the traps." "Among other things," he said. He gestured to the chair across from him with an openness that was both simple and courteous. "Sit down, Miss Wallace. Mrs. Crane's cornbread is better hot." She sat and Mrs. Crane appeared from somewhere in the back of the house with more bread and a jar of honey without being asked, which suggested she had opinions about the proximity of her boarders and was doing her small part to encourage conversation. "How do you know Garrett Sully?" Cora asked, because she had been thinking about what Elias had said on the street, and she was not the kind of person who left questions alone once she had noticed them. Elias was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug between those large, scarred hands. "He tried to file a claim on the northwest pasture of the old Henderson ranch 3 years back, while Henderson was up north on a hunting trip. Said Henderson had abandoned it. Henderson had been gone 6 weeks, and I went to the territorial office in Cheyenne and filed a formal protest on Henderson's behalf. By the time Sully's claim went to review, Henderson was back and had the documentation to prove continuous occupation. Sully lost the claim." He paused. "He has been patient since then. He does not move fast. He moves quiet." "He moves when people are vulnerable," Cora said. "Yes," Elias said simply. "That is exactly right." She looked at him across the table. In the morning light, the amber of his eyes was clearer, warmer, and there was something in the way he was looking at her that was not quite curiosity and not quite something else she did not yet have a name for. It was attention, she decided. Genuine, unflinching attention of the kind that did not require anything from her in return. "My father's land," she said. "Wallace Creek Quarter. Do you know it?" Something warm shifted in his expression. "I know it," he said. "I passed through that stretch of valley regularly for years. Your father had cattle on the lower pasture, and the cabin sat back against the tree line near the creek. He planted cottonwoods along the fence line." "He wrote to me about those cottonwoods," Cora said quietly. "He was a good man," Elias said, and the simplicity of it, the complete absence of qualification or performance, hit her somewhere under the breastbone with a force she had not expected. Not because the sentiment was new to her, but because of the way he said it, as though James Wallace had been seen and known, not just recognized by name. "Did you know him well?" she asked. "Well enough. He traded at the post here sometimes. He helped me pull a horse out of the creek in the spring floods 3 years ago." Elias was quiet for a moment. "He talked about you." Cora went very still. "He called you his Cora girl," Elias said. "He said you were the smartest person he had ever known, and that you were going to do something remarkable someday, and that he hoped the world was wide enough to hold whatever it was you decided to do." For a moment she could not speak. She looked down at the table and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed carefully through her nose until she was sure she was not going to embarrass herself. "I'm sorry," Elias said quietly. "No," she said, and she looked up, and her eyes were bright, but she did not let them overflow, and her chin was steady. "Thank you. That is, thank you. Most people say he was a good man and leave it there. Knowing that he spoke about me to people here, it means something." He nodded. And that was enough. They ate the rest of breakfast mostly in a comfortable quiet that surprised her, punctuated by Mrs. Crane bringing more coffee and commenting on the weather and the state of the road from Cheyenne, which she said was terrible this time of year and a disgrace to the territory. At 8:30, Cora stood and began gathering her documents from the side table where she had left them. Elias stood too, which was automatic and seemed unconscious, the kind of courtesy that had been lived into the bones rather than taught. "I am going to the land office," she said. "I know," he said. "I do not need anyone to come with me," she said, which was not quite the same thing as asking him not to come, and they both understood that, and he seemed to understand also that this distinction was important to her. "I will be at the hardware store this morning," he said. "It is 3 doors from Sully's office." "Noted," she said, and left. Sully received her at 9 o'clock with a manner that had been recalibrated overnight from false sympathy to careful neutrality. He had looked at her documents, he said. The land grant was real. The inheritance documentation appeared to be in order. However, he said, there was the matter of the notice period. "There is no confirmed date of posting on that notice," Cora said again, keeping her voice level. "Territorial Ordinance Section 14, Paragraph 3, states clearly that the 30-day window begins from the verified date of public posting, not the date the notice was written. Without a verified posting date, the notice cannot be used to enforce a lapse." "That is one interpretation," Sully said. "It is the only interpretation that is consistent with the plain language of the ordinance," Cora said. She opened her folder and set a handwritten copy of the relevant paragraph on his desk. "I copied this from the original ordinance text at the Territorial Records Office in Cheyenne before I left. You are welcome to compare it with the original." Sully looked at the paper for a long time without touching it. Then he looked up at her with an expression that had finally arrived at something honest, which happened to be resentment. "The land has been sitting vacant for 6 months," he said. "The cattle were sold off in April. The cabin is in poor repair. You have been living in Cincinnati." "I have been the legal heir of that property since March of this year," Cora said. "No lapse of residence applies to an inherited property during the period of legal settlement of an estate. That is also in the ordinance." She paused. "I suggest we stop having this conversation and start the formal paperwork to reinstate the claim in my name. I would like to have it completed by the end of the week." Sully was silent for a long moment. "I will need to send to Cheyenne to verify a few things," he said finally. "Of course," Cora said. "I will be here." She walked out into the clean fall morning and stood on the boardwalk with her face tilted toward the sun for a moment, letting the warmth of it settle her nerves. She had not shown Sully how hard her heart had been beating for the last 40 minutes. "Miss Wallace," she turned. Elias Holloway was standing in the doorway of the hardware store 3 buildings down, one shoulder against the frame, watching her with that careful amber attention. She walked toward him. "How did it go?" he asked. "He is going to make it difficult," she said. "But I have the documents and I know the ordinance and I do not intend to leave until it is done." Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face, more like the shadow of approval. "Good," he said. "He mentioned the cabin is in poor repair," she said. "I would like to go out and see it. Can you tell me how far it is from town?" "About 8 miles northwest," he said, "through the valley and up past the first ridge." "Is the road passable on horseback?" "Yes, but I would not go alone until you know the lay of the land." He looked at her steadily. "I know the way. I can take you out tomorrow morning if you want." She considered him for a moment, the size of him, the straight-ahead quality of his attention, the way he had said her father was a good man without requiring anything in return for the saying of it. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow morning." He nodded. "What do you do up in these mountains, Mr. Holloway?" She asked because she was curious and she did not see the point of not being. "Trap mostly," he said. "Some hunting. I guide parties out from Cheyenne sometimes when they want to see the high country. I have a cabin up past the second ridge, about 12 miles from here." He paused. "I come to town a few times a month for supplies." "And you stay at Mrs. Crane's when you do?" "She is the only boarding house in Dry Creek that does not smell like a saloon," he said. Cora laughed. It surprised both of them, the laugh. It came out full and genuine, and she saw him blink at it as though it was something unexpected in the landscape, like finding a flower growing out of rock. 9 o'clock tomorrow," she said. "I will have horses ready," he said. She walked back toward the general store, needing to buy supplies for her stay, and she was aware that she was still smiling and she did not particularly try to stop. The ride out to Wallace Creek Quarter the next morning was one of the most beautiful things Cora had experienced since coming west, though she would not have said so in those terms, because she was still in the mode of businesslike purpose and beauty felt like an indulgence she had not yet earned. But the truth of it was there anyway, unavoidable, the valley spreading out golden in the September light, the aspens already beginning to turn along the creek beds, the Wind River Range rising in the west in a blue-white line that looked painted rather than real, and Elias Holloway riding ahead of her on a large gray horse with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life in this landscape, and carried it in his body, the way other men carried their histories. He was a careful guide, not hovering or fussing, but pointing out things she needed to know. The trail that looked good but had soft ground beneath it. The creek crossing that ran shallow in September but could be dangerous in spring. The place where the deer came down from the high meadows in the early morning. "You said you guide parties from Cheyenne," Cora said as they rode. "What kind of parties?" "Mostly wealthy men who want to say they have seen the high country," he said. "Sometimes journalists, sometimes scientists. There was a geological survey party 2 years ago that I took up past the snowline." He paused. "Sometimes hunters who want a trophy more than they want an experience. Which do you prefer?" "The scientists," he said without hesitation. "They ask good questions and they write down what they see. The wealthy men just want something to talk about at dinner." She smiled at the back of his head. "You are not what I expected," she said. He half turned in the saddle to look at her. "What did you expect?" "I am not sure. Less reading, perhaps. Most mountain men I have read about in newspapers seem to be primarily concerned with tobacco and the price of beaver pelts." This time he did smile, and she saw it fully for the first time. It changed his face considerably, deepening the lines at the corners of his eyes and making him look less like a landmark and more like a person. "I trap for income," he said, "but I read when the weather keeps me in. I have 2 boxes of books at the cabin. It gets long in a blizzard with nothing but a fire and your own company." "What do you read?" "Whatever I can get. Dickens, historical accounts, the complete proceedings of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which I have read 3 times. He turned back to the trail. "Your father had a small library in his cabin. We talked about books once or twice when I passed through." "He loved Dickens," Cora said softly. "He wrote me letters about Dickens. About how the characters felt true to him, even though England and Wyoming Territory are as far apart as 2 places can be." "Characters feel true when they are," Elias said simply. They rode in easy silence for a while after that, and the trail climbed slightly and bent northwest, and the creek appeared on their right, running clear and quick over pale stones, and then the cottonwoods came into view, a line of them along the fence just as her father had written. And now they were tall and rustling in the September wind, and the sight of them hit Cora with a wave of grief, so sudden and clean that she had to grip her reins harder to keep from making a sound. Her father had planted those trees. She had never seen them before, but they were here, growing out of this earth, and they were his, which meant they were hers, and she had made it here in time to see them. The cabin came into view a moment later, set back against the tree line exactly as Elias had described it. It was a small structure of chinked logs with a stone chimney and a porch that ran the width of the front. Sully had been right about one thing: it needed work. The roof sagged slightly on the eastern side, and 2 of the porch boards were visibly rotted through, and one of the shutters hung crookedly from a single hinge. But the bones of it were solid. The walls were thick and the chimney was straight, and the door, when Cora pushed it open and stepped inside, swung on good iron hinges without complaint. Inside, the air smelled of old ash and dust, and something faintly beneath both of those things that was pine and canvas and the specific smell of habitation. The scent of a life lived in a space, even a life that had been over for 6 months. The single room held a narrow iron bedstead with a bare mattress, a table and 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, a set of shelves against the back wall. On the shelves were tin cups, a few plates, a jar of dried beans that had been there so long the beans had begun to harden into small stones, and a row of books. Cora crossed to the books immediately. She ran her finger along the spines. Dickens, a battered copy of the King James Bible with a broken spine. A collection of Robert Burns' poetry, a surveyor's manual, a hand-drawn map of the surrounding land that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creased lines had gone soft and pale, and tucked at the end, almost falling, a small leather-bound journal. She took it down and opened it, her father's handwriting shaky but legible. The last entry was dated February 12, 1879, 14 days before he had died. She closed the journal without reading it. Not yet. There were things that needed to happen first, and she needed to be in a steadier place to read those last pages. She tucked the journal into her coat pocket. Elias had not followed her inside. She found him walking the perimeter of the cabin, studying the structure with the practiced eye of someone who knew how to assess what needed fixing and in what order. "The roof will need attention before winter," he said when she emerged. "The east side has 2 bad beams. The porch boards are just rot that is straightforward. The shutter is nothing." He looked at her. "The structure itself is sound. Your father built it well. Can it be made livable?" He looked at her for a moment. "You intend to live here?" "That is why I came," she said. "This is my land, my family's claim. I am not going to restore the title and then go back to Cincinnati." He studied her face for a long moment with that careful amber attention, and then he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "it can be made livable. It will take a few weeks of work, but yes. I will pay for materials and labor," she said. "I can help with the structural work," he said. "I know this kind of building, but for now you should not stay out here until the roof is fixed. Another hard rain on that east side and you will have water coming in." "I am at Mrs. Crane's for now," she said. "That will do while the work is done." They stood together in the September sunlight in front of the cabin, looking at it, and Cora felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since March, since the stranger's letter, since she had understood that her father's land was in danger of being taken from her by men who profited from other people's grief and distance. "My father built this," she said quietly. "He filed on this land and built this cabin and planted those cottonwoods, and the land has his name on it. My name is Wallace, the same as his, and I will not let it be taken." "Then it will not be taken," Elias said, and the way he said it was not reassurance exactly. It was something more like a statement of fact, quiet and absolute, and it was the most comforting thing anyone had said to her since she had left Cincinnati. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the fence and made the kind of sound that is half music and half something older than music. "Thank you for bringing me out here," she said. "Thank you for letting me," he said. The following 2 weeks were the most complicated and the most unexpectedly alive weeks of Cora's adult life. The business with Sully moved slowly, as she had expected it would. He sent his inquiry to the territorial office in Cheyenne, and she immediately wrote her own letter to the same office, enclosing copies of all her documentation and a carefully reasoned argument about the posting date issue. She also visited the sheriff, a weathered, fair-minded man named Sheriff Aldous Briggs, who had been in Dry Creek since the Silver Days, and had no particular patience for claim jumping regardless of how legally dressed up it tried to be. He confirmed in writing the date of her arrival in town, which was September 3, 1879, and he filed this confirmation with both the land office and the territorial office. He also confirmed, when Cora asked him directly, that the notice on the post outside the general store had gone up on August 29th, which made her arrival 5 days inside the 30-day window. When she told this to Sully, the last of his strategies visibly collapsed like a poorly maintained mine shaft. He was quiet for a moment, and then he picked up his pen and began filling out the transfer paperwork, and Cora stood on the other side of his desk and watched him write. and she kept her face completely still until she walked out of his office with the completed paperwork in her folder, the word approved stamped across the top in red ink. And then she stopped on the boardwalk and pressed her closed hands against her mouth and breathed hard for a moment because the relief of it was enormous. It was September 15th. She was the legal owner of Wallace Creek Quarter. She went directly to Mrs. Crane's and wrote a letter to her father's attorney in Cheyenne informing him of the successful claim, and then she sat down on her bed and opened her father's journal and read all of it from the first entry to the last. It took 2 hours. The journal began in the fall of 1878 when her father's health had first begun to decline, and he had been managing the cattle alone through the winter with increasing difficulty. It recorded the small daily events of a man's life on the frontier: the weather, the condition of the cattle, the occasional visitor who stopped at the cabin for water or a meal or conversation. It recorded his loneliness in the spare, practical way of a man who acknowledged facts but did not dramatize them. It recorded his thoughts about Cora, which were frequent and loving and occasionally worried. He had been afraid she would not come for the land, that the distance and the difficulty would make it easier to let go. He had been afraid the land would be lost and that the losing of it would somehow diminish what he had tried to build, not just materially but in the larger sense of what he had hoped to leave behind, some proof that a man named James Wallace had put down roots in this soil and made something real. The last entry read, February 12th. Cold has not broken. Ribs hurt when I breathe deep. Cora, if you read this, the land is yours and it has always been yours, and the name Wallace belongs on this earth the same as the creek does, and I hope you come and find it waiting. Cora closed the journal and held it against her chest for a long time. Then she wiped her face, put on her coat, and went to tell Elias Holloway that the land was hers. She found him where she had found him most evenings since their ride out to the cabin, at the table behind Mrs. Crane's house, where he sat to do whatever repairing or mending or crafting occupied his hands in the hours between supper and dark. He was working on a set of leather harness straps with a needle and heavy thread, his big hands moving with a surprising delicacy over the stitching, and he looked up when she came around the corner of the house, and something in his expression shifted to attention in the way she had come to recognize, and if she was honest with herself, to look forward to. "It is done," she said. "The claim is approved. The land is mine." He set down the harness. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Cora Wallace," and he said her name the way very few people said it, with both halves of it given equal weight, as though the Wallace were not just a name attached to her first name but a whole thing in itself, a thing with history and meaning and value. He said it the way her father had written it in the journal, the way it should have always been said. She had not expected it to matter so much. She had not expected the way it would hit her, a full-body warmth that started somewhere around her chest and spread outward, and it was only partly about the land and the name and all that they meant. The other part of it was standing in front of her with amber eyes and scarred hands and an expression that contained more genuine regard than she had been the recipient of in a long time. "You earned it," he said simply. "My father earned it," she said. "And you came here and defended it, and that is an earning too," he said. "He would be glad." She sat down in the other chair at the table, and they talked for a long time in the gathering dark, about the land, about the repairs that still needed doing on the cabin, about what she planned to do with it in the coming months. She had some money from Cincinnati, not a great deal, but enough to get through the winter if she was careful. She would need to think about cattle eventually, and a better vegetable plot, and perhaps chickens. The cabin would be livable within another week, he said. He had done the roof beams on the last 2 days while she had been managing the paperwork, and a friend of his, a carpenter named Amos Birch, had replaced the porch boards. "You have been fixing my cabin," she said, looking at him. "The beams needed doing before rain came in," he said, as though this explained everything. "Elias," she said, and she used his first name for the first time and saw him register it, the slight shift of attention, a deepening. "You have been spending your own time on my property." "I was not needed elsewhere," he said. "That is not the point." "No," he said and looked at her directly. "The point is that it needed doing and I could do it, and I wanted to." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father's cabin deserves to stand, and you deserve to have somewhere solid to come home to." The word home did something in her chest. She had not thought of anywhere as home since her father had sent her to Cincinnati, which had been Aunt's house and then a rented room, and then simply the place she left from. The idea of this cabin, this land, as home, it was something she was still learning the shape of. "Tell me about your cabin," she said, partly to move the conversation away from the vulnerability she could feel gathering in herself, and partly because she genuinely wanted to know. He described it simply and without embellishment: a single main room and a small sleeping loft, built 12 years ago when he had first come to the territory at 22. He had built it himself over 2 summers, learning as he went, making mistakes and correcting them and making different mistakes and correcting those too. He had a good stove and a passable chimney, and the books he had mentioned, and he had a covered pen for the horses and a cold cellar in the hillside where he kept what needed keeping. It was a good 12 miles from town, and he liked the distance most of the time, though he liked the company when he came to Dry Creek too, more than he generally showed. "You are not very much like what I expected from a mountain man," she said again, and this time there was warmth in it rather than mere observation. "You said that before," he noted. "I am saying it again because I mean it in a different way now," she said. He looked at her with those amber eyes in the dark, and the last of the evening light made everything amber and warm, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. And in that moment, something shifted between them that was unmistakable and also, for just that evening, remained unspoken. The cabin was ready by the 21st of September, which was earlier than Cora had expected, and she moved her things from Mrs. Crane's with the mixture of excitement and solemnity that she imagined might be appropriate for occupying a place that was both completely new to her and also, in some deep way that was harder to explain, profoundly familiar. Elias rode out with her to help carry her things and to show her how the new beams had been fitted, and where the roof had been reinforced and what she needed to watch for if the winter was heavy. He walked her through the stove and the chimney flue and explained the cold cellar and showed her where he had stacked wood against the east side of the house, a full quart of it, more than she had asked for. "Elias," she said, standing in the doorway looking at the woodpile. "Winter comes early at this elevation," he said from beside his horse. She turned to face him. She had been noticing things about him for 2 weeks now, which was perhaps inevitable given the amount of time they had spent in each other's company, and which she had mostly been managing by keeping herself busy with the legal work and the cabin preparations. But standing here in the September afternoon light on the land that was now, truly and legally, hers, with this man who had carried her father's memory gently and fixed her roof without being asked, and said her name with both halves weighted equally, she stopped managing it. "Why?" she said, and she meant the question as a whole question, not just about the wood. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with that steady, unhurried attention that had stopped feeling overwhelming weeks ago and now felt simply like being seen. "Because I want you to be all right," he said. "Because I would like you to still be here in the spring." He paused. "Because you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in 12 years in this territory, and I do not think I exaggerate when I say that." She was quiet for a long moment looking at him. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. The creek ran bright over its pale stones. The mountains stood enormous and close in the western sky. "I am going to need help with the cattle eventually," she said carefully. "When I have money enough to buy a small herd, I will need advice on the land and what it can support. I know cattle," he said, "and I know this valley. And you know where the creek runs in spring and where the soft ground is and what the weather does up here in winter." "Yes," he said, "and you are 12 miles away." "Yes," he said again, and something shifted in his expression, a questioning that was careful and genuine and not at all presumptuous, because that was how he was. She had come to understand, careful and genuine and not presumptuous. "That is not very far," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she smiled. And this smile was different from the surprised laugh of that first morning at Mrs. Crane's table. It was slower and surer, and it was entirely for him, and he looked at it the way he had looked at the first one, as though it was something unexpected and worth keeping. "I will make coffee," she said, "if you have time." "I have time," he said. He tied his horse to the porch post and came inside, ducking slightly through the doorway. And she built a fire in the stove and found the coffee she had brought from the general store. And they sat at her father's table in her father's cabin on her land in the last warm light of a September afternoon. And it was the most at home Cora had felt since she was a small child. They talked until the light was completely gone and the stars were out in the enormous Wyoming sky, and she lit the oil lamp and they kept talking. And at some point, the conversation shifted from practical matters to the kind of conversation that happens between two people who have been circling the real subject for a while and have finally come close enough to it to see its shape. "Were you ever married?" she asked. She had wanted to know for a while. "No," he said. "I came out here young, and the life I built here does not easily accommodate." He paused, choosing his words with the care she had noticed he always used. "It is not a life that asks someone else to be comfortable with a great deal of absence and difficulty." "You have been alone 12 years, she said. "By choice," he said. "Mostly." He looked at the lamp flame for a moment. "I think sometimes the choice was easier than it needed to be." She understood what he was not quite saying. "And now?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "Now I am not sure the choice is as simple as it was," he said. "Neither am I," she said quietly. They looked at each other across the table in the lamplight, and it was honest and uncomplicated and also enormous. The way the mountains outside were enormous, too large to take in all at once, requiring time and the right angle of approach. "It is late," he said eventually. "I should ride back." "You could stay in the valley," she said. "There is a place past the second bend in the creek where you camped before you told me." "I know it," he said. "It is too dark to ride the 12 miles safely," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Then stay in the valley tonight," she said, "and we will figure out what direction things are heading in the morning." He nodded and stood and gathered his coat and paused at the door. "Cora Wallace," he said, and again the name was full and complete. Both halves waited, and it settled over her like warmth. "Good night, Elias Holloway," she said. He smiled, that full, rare smile that changed his whole face, and went out into the night. October in the Wind River Valley was spectacular and brutal in almost equal measure. The aspens turned a gold so intense it seemed to vibrate against the dark evergreens and the pale blue sky. And the light had that particular slanted autumn quality that made everything look significant and temporary all at once. And the nights dropped to near freezing by the second week of the month, and frost appeared on the meadow grass each morning. And the mountains were white down to a lower elevation every day. Elias came to the valley 3 times in the first 2 weeks of October, and each time he came he stayed a day and helped with whatever needed doing, and they talked and ate together, and the thing between them grew more explicit without either of them forcing it. He was teaching her things, not condescendingly, but practically and respectfully, the way one person teaches another who is clearly capable and only lacks specific information. He showed her how to read the weather from the mountains, what the cloud formations meant, and what the wind direction told you, how to bank the stove at night to keep coals through the cold until morning, how to check the cabin's caulking before the first real snow. She taught him things in return, which surprised him and pleased her. She knew medicine, not formally but practically, from nursing her elderly aunt in Cincinnati, and from reading whatever she could get her hands on. She knew mathematics thoroughly, and she could draft a legal argument with a precision that had already, twice, impressed people who had underestimated her. She taught him a card game she had learned from a neighbor in Cincinnati that he had never seen before, and he beat her at it within 20 minutes of learning the rules, which she found both annoying and impressive. On the third visit, in the middle of the second week, he asked her to come up to his cabin. "I want you to see it," he said. "I want you to see what my life looks like when I am there." She understood the weight of the invitation. She accepted it. They rode up together on a clear morning, through the valley and up the first ridge, and along the trail she had not yet been on, through forests that grew denser and older as the elevation increased, and the air changed, becoming thinner and sharper and carrying a scent of pine and cold stone that was unlike anything she had encountered before, and that she found, unexpectedly, as natural as breathing. His cabin was larger than she had expected. Not large in any grand sense, but solid and well-built, and clearly the work of someone who had thought carefully about how to use space efficiently and live in a place, rather than just occupy it. The covered pen held 3 horses, a mule, and a goat he had apparently acquired by accident and had never gotten rid of. The cold cellar was cut deep into the hillside and was impressively stocked. The main room had the stove, a table and chairs, a shelf of books, and there were indeed 2 full boxes of books, some of them looking very well read. There were tools hung neatly on one wall and pelts stacked in a corner, and a window that looked out at a view of the high peaks that was simply extraordinary. He made coffee, and they stood at the window looking at the peaks, and she understood completely why he had stayed here for 12 years. "It is beautiful," she said, and the word was insufficient, but he knew that and accepted it anyway. "Yes," he said. He was standing close enough that his arm was almost touching her shoulder, and they were both looking out the window, and she could feel the warmth of him there beside her, and she thought that she had been looking for this kind of home, not a place exactly, but a feeling, a combination of belonging and presence and being known for a very long time. She turned to face him at the same moment he turned to face her, which meant they were suddenly much closer than the window viewing arrangement had required, and for a moment neither of them moved. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice was quieter than usual, lower. "Tell me," she said. "I have not been able to think about anything except you for the last 3 weeks," he said. "I wake up thinking about you, and I work all day thinking about you, and I sleep thinking about you, and that has not happened to me before, not in 12 years of being alone up here, and I think—" He stopped, searching for the right words with the care he always used. "I think you should know that, before this goes any further, because you deserve honesty, and you deserve a man who tells you the truth about where he stands." Cora looked at him for a long moment. His amber eyes were steady and serious, and there was nothing performative about what he had just said. It had cost him something, the saying of it, and he had said it anyway. "I have been thinking about you too," she said. "Constantly, which is inconvenient given that I have had an enormous amount of practical things to focus on." Something in his expression broke open into that rare, full smile, and she laughed. And then, without any further preamble or ceremony, he brought his hand up and touched her face very gently with the backs of his scarred, calloused fingers, as though he was making sure she was real, and she leaned into his hand a little, and that was all it took. He kissed her in the light from that extraordinary window with the peaks behind them and the goat making a sound from the pen outside, and it was warm and careful, and then considerably less careful. And when they finally stepped back from each other, they were both breathing unsteadily and looking at each other with the expression of 2 people who have just discovered something that is going to change everything, and are not the slightest bit sorry about it. "Well," Cora said. "Yes," Elias said, and he was still smiling. "I think," she said, "that this is a significant development." "I think so too," he said. She stayed at his cabin for dinner, and they talked until late in the evening, and then he rode back down with her to her cabin to make sure she arrived safely. And at her door they stood in the cold, clear night with the stars enormous overhead, and he held both her hands in his large ones and looked at her with everything in his face that he had been careful not to show for 3 weeks. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly. I know this territory does not always stand on ceremony, but you came here to claim something that is yours, and that means you deserve everything that is done right and nothing that is done carelessly." "Elias Holloway," she said, looking up at him, "you are the least careless man I have ever met." He raised her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a gentleness that was wholly at odds with the size and strength of him, and she felt that warmth again, all through her, and she thought of her father's last journal entry, and hoped that somewhere he knew that his Cora girl had found someone who said her name right. Elias rode home under the stars. The courtship that followed was, by the standards of Wyoming Territory in 1879, both unconventional and entirely proper. It was unconventional because there was no parlor to sit in, no mother to be present, no calling cards or formal visiting hours or any of the rituals that courtship involved in cities. It was proper because of the way they conducted themselves within those conditions, openly and honestly, and without deception about what they felt or what they were doing. He came to the valley more frequently. She rode up to his cabin when the trail permitted. They worked together on the practical business of preparing her land for winter and getting to know the particulars of each other's daily lives. And in the interstices of all of that, they fell further in love in the way that is most durable, which is through attention and ordinary time spent together. She discovered that he had a temper, which was controlled and rarely came out, but was formidable when something genuinely unjust crossed his path. He had words for Garrett Sully that she had not heard him use before when Sully made one last attempt in late October to file a nuisance challenge against the claim on a technicality, so thin it was almost transparent. Elias went to the sheriff's office and sat with Cora while she addressed the challenge, and the expression on his face during that conversation was enough to make Sully very efficiently decide the technicality was not worth pursuing. He discovered that she had a stubborn streak that was both her greatest strength and occasionally an obstacle to accepting help she genuinely needed. She insisted on splitting her own firewood well into November when her shoulder was sore and she would not say so, and it took him noticing the way she was holding herself before he quietly took the axe and finished the pile without comment, which was exactly the right response because it did not make it about her pride. They argued once seriously in early November. He wanted her to come to his cabin for the worst part of the winter, when the passes could close and the valley could be cut off, and she would be alone at the Wallace Creek cabin without anyone within reasonable distance if something went wrong. She wanted to stay on her land, which she had spent everything she had to claim and had no intention of abandoning even temporarily. The argument was real and heated and lasted 3 days, conducted mostly by letter since the weather had made riding difficult, and was resolved when she made the reasonable point that she had survived perfectly well before Elias Holloway had existed in her life, and would be able to manage a winter on her own land. And he made the reasonable counterpoint that surviving and being safe were not always identical, and they compromised. He would come down to the valley cabin every 10 days through the worst of winter, and she would have a signal lamp ready in the window that he could see from a certain point on the upper trail if something was wrong. It was a practical and sensible compromise, and it was also, in its way, a declaration, because it assumed a future in which they would still be in each other's lives through the winter and beyond, and neither of them disputed that assumption. In late November, on a day when the sky was the brilliant cold blue that Wyoming winter sky specializes in, he rode down to the valley and told her he had something he needed to ask her. She was at the table going over her accounts, and she looked up at him standing in the doorway of her father's cabin, enormous in the frame of it, his breath misting in the cold air, snowflakes on his coat shoulders and his dark hair pulled back, and his amber eyes serious and warm in equal measure. And she knew what he was going to say before he said it. He sat down across from her at the table where they had sat and talked so many times now that it had become the most familiar and comfortable place in her world. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to spend my life with you here in this valley on this land, and I will do everything in my power for the rest of my life to be worth the name you would carry alongside yours." He paused, and his voice was steady, but she could see what it cost him to be this open, this fully visible. "I know what you came here to do. You came to claim what is yours and prove what your name means and build a life that is your own, and I would not ask you to diminish any of that for anything in the world. I am asking to be part of it, if you will have me." Cora Wallace looked at Elias Holloway across the table in her father's cabin on her father's land, in the clear winter light coming through the window her father had built, and she thought of the journal entry she had read alone in her room at Mrs. Crane's boarding house. "I hope you come and find it waiting," and she thought that her father had perhaps known something she had not, that what was waiting here was not only land but possibility. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He exhaled as though he had been holding that breath for a long time, and then he stood and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her face in both his large hands and looked at her for a long moment. And then he kissed her with everything in him. All the 12 years alone and all the weeks of careful restraint, and all the vast, steady, genuine love he had been building since the first morning at Mrs. Crane's breakfast table, and she kissed him back with everything in herself, all the grief and determination, and the months of travel, and the years of longing for exactly this kind of solidity. And it was a very good kiss, perhaps the best kiss in the history of Wyoming Territory, though that is the kind of claim that cannot be objectively verified. They were married in December, in the unfinished church in Dry Creek, on a day when the temperature was bitter, and the snow had been falling for 2 days, and the whole town came anyway because small towns in the Wild West were short on entertainment. And a mountain man marrying the woman who had faced down Garrett Sully and claimed her family's land was the best story to come through Dry Creek in years. Mrs. Crane brought a cake she had made from cornmeal and dried fruit and honey that was better than it had any right to be. Sheriff Briggs served as witness. Amos Birch, who had fixed the porch boards, played harmonica with more enthusiasm than skill. Mr. Lau from the boarding house, who was still in Dry Creek doing accounts, offered a brief dignified toast in both English and Cantonese that no one fully understood but everyone appreciated. Garrett Sully was not in attendance. The Reverend McKittrick, who had been trying to finish the church's walls since 1876 and had mostly given up, conducted the ceremony with a warmth that surprised Cora, because she had expected frontier clergy to be dry and formulaic, and he was instead genuinely delighted to preside over what he called a proper love match between two serious people, which was, he said, the best kind. Elias stood at the front of that unfinished church in the best coat he owned, which was better than she had expected, and when she walked toward him on Mrs. Crane's arm, because she had no father to give her away, and Mrs. Crane had offered herself with the no-nonsense practicality that characterized everything she did, he looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not just admiration, though it was that. It was not just love, though it was most certainly that. It was recognition, the look of a man who had been alone long enough to know exactly what he had found, and had no intention of ever taking it for granted. When the Reverend asked if she took Elias Holloway to be her husband, she said, "I do," in the clear, direct voice of a woman who had defended her family name before a land agent at 24, and knew what it was to stand by what she meant. When the Reverend asked if Elias Holloway took Cora Wallace to be his wife, he said, "I do," in the deep, steady voice of a man who had decided something once, and was not the kind to undecide it. Afterward, standing outside in the snow with the wind cutting down from the mountains and their breath misting together in the cold air, she said to him, "Cora Holloway," trying the sound of it. He looked at her carefully. "Or Cora Wallace Holloway," he said. "Both names if you want them." She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "Both names," she said. "Cora Wallace Holloway." "That is a name with weight to it," he said. "That is exactly what I want," she said. They went back to the cabin on Wallace Creek that evening together through the snow, with the lamp lit in the window and the stove warm inside, and it was the first night of what was to be a remarkable life. The winter was hard, as Wyoming winters are, but they were together through it, which made it something different from what hard winters usually are. Elias had moved into the valley cabin with her. His own cabin would remain, he said, as a place to stay during trapping runs in the high country, but the valley was his home now, because she was there, and the two of them figured out the rhythms of sharing a space and a life with the same methodical care they brought to everything else, which is to say imperfectly but earnestly and with a great deal of goodwill on both sides. He taught her things she had not known she would love, how to track through snow, reading the stories animals wrote in it with their passing, how to hear the mountain in winter, the sounds that meant more snow coming, and the sounds that meant a clear day ahead, how to be still enough that the wild things around the cabin came close and treated the humans as simply part of the landscape rather than intruders in it. She woke one morning in January to find a family of deer standing in the cottonwood line, so close she could see the frost on their eyelashes, and she stood in the open doorway in the cold and watched them for 10 minutes until they moved on, and Elias came and stood behind her with his arms around her and his chin resting on the top of her head, and they watched together in the profound quiet that is one of winter's best gifts. She taught him things he had not known he was missing. She read aloud to him in the evenings, from the Dickens and the Burns, and from a collection of correspondence between Frederick Douglass and various correspondents that she had found in a Cheyenne bookseller before she left, and the discussions that followed the reading were some of the best conversations she had ever had. He was a man whose intelligence was practical rather than academic, but who thought deeply about things once they were put in front of him, and he had strong views about injustice. The kind of views that come from having lived in a territory where injustice was not abstract, but was the particular injustice of stolen land and broken promises, and the grinding machinery of power applied to people who had less of it. They talked about the indigenous peoples of the territory with a frankness that was unusual for the time and the place. Elias had spent enough time in the high country to know, and to some extent know of the people who had been there long before any settlement, and he was clear-eyed about what had been done and what was being done, and he did not romanticize it or diminish it, and Cora respected him deeply for that, even as they both understood their own complicated place in the larger story of this land. Spring came in late April, in the particular explosive way of high-altitude springs, going from brown and frozen to green and wild in what felt like a single week, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt, the meadow filling with wildflowers that appeared overnight and carpeted the ground in colors so improbable they made Cora laugh with delight the first time she came out to find them. She had written to her aunt in Cincinnati through the winter long letters full of detail and warmth, describing the land and the weather and her work and her husband and her life in terms that she knew would alarm her practical aunt, and also, she hoped, make her proud. The letters she received back were cautious at first, and then, as the winter progressed, and it became clear that Cora was not merely managing but genuinely thriving, increasingly warm. Her aunt sent seeds in the spring letter, flower seeds and vegetable seeds she had saved, wrapped in careful paper packets with notes in her aunt's precise hand. Cora planted them along the south-facing wall of the cabin and tended them with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. In May, she and Elias rode together to Cheyenne to formalize several things: the land title transfer to Cora Wallace Holloway, the filing of a new survey of the Wallace Creek quarter parcel, and various other legal and practical business that required the territorial offices. They stayed 3 nights in Cheyenne, and it was the first time Cora had been back since she had left it in September, and walking through the city with Elias beside her, she was aware, with a sudden and complete certainty, of how much she had changed in 8 months, and how entirely it was because of what she had done and what she had found. On the second day in Cheyenne, she bought two things: a proper surveyor's map of the territory to add to her father's hand-drawn one, and a small framed photograph of herself and Elias taken by a photographer on the main street, because she wanted something tangible of this moment, this life, and she thought her father would have liked it. She put the photograph on the shelf in the cabin next to the row of books, where her father's journal already stood, and she looked at it sometimes in the evenings and thought about what it meant to have your name belong to a place. By summer, the Wallace Creek quarter was functioning as a working property again. Elias had helped her acquire a small herd of cattle, 15 head to start, bought from a rancher north of town who was reducing his operation, and they were running on the lower pasture in the long summer days, fat and unhurried, and the creek was full of cold, clear water, and the cottonwoods were tall and singing in the wind. She had a vegetable garden that was producing more than she could eat, supplemented by the seeds from her aunt, and a small herb garden along the south wall, and 3 chickens she had bought from Mrs. Crane when the boarding house suddenly found itself with more chickens than it needed. The chickens were named Dickens, Burns, and Ordnance, the third name being Elias' idea, and reflecting a dry humor that she had come to deeply appreciate. Elias still made his trapping runs into the high country, sometimes for several days at a time, and she was all right with this in the way she was all right with the reality of who he was, a man of the mountains, of solitude and open sky. And his need for those things was not a diminishment of what he brought home to her, but a part of what made him whole, and therefore a part of what she loved. When he came home from those runs, he always came home with the full attention of a man who had been away from what he valued and knew it, and the evenings when he returned were some of her favorite evenings. She was 3 months pregnant by July, which she told him on a warm evening when the fireflies were doing their brief summer thing along the creek, and the mountains were lavender in the late light. She had known for a week but had wanted to be certain. He sat very still for a moment, and then he made a sound that was partly a laugh and mostly something deeper than a laugh, and he pulled her against him with his arms around her and his face against her hair, and she could feel the steady, enormous warmth of him and the trembling that was not weakness but the particular kind of emotion that even very strong men cannot contain when it is large enough. "A Elias Holloway," he said quietly into her hair. "Yes," she said. "Your father would have been—" He stopped. "I know," she said. "I know." They sat on the porch in the firefly evening for a long time after that. The pregnancy was good, healthier than she had expected and more instructive. Mrs. Crane came out to the valley twice with the same practical maternal energy she brought to everything, and a woman named Ruth Hatcher, who had been midwife to half the babies in the territory, came out in early fall to check on things, and pronounced Cora healthy and her preparations sensible. Elias was, predictably, protective in that contained and non-overbearing way of his, making sure everything heavy was taken care of without making her feel incapable, riding to town for anything she needed, adding more logs to the woodpile at the east side of the cabin, until it constituted what Cora called a structural feature rather than a supply. "There is enough wood to survive until 1885, she told him in October. "Good," he said serenely. She laughed. The baby came in March of 1881, on a late winter day when the snow was still on the ground, but the light had that particular quality that suggests spring is a real promise rather than a distant theory. Ruth Hatcher was present, and Elias paced the front room with his hands clasped behind his back, and the expression of a man exercising every available resource of self-control. And Mrs. Crane had ridden out the day before and was in the kitchen making enough food for a small army, which was her method of managing anxiety. The baby was a boy. Elias came into the room when Ruth called him, and Cora was sitting up against the pillows with the infant in her arms, and the look on his face when he crossed to her and looked at his son for the first time was something she would carry inside her for the rest of her life, pure and undone and grateful in a way that stripped everything else away and left only the essential truth of what mattered. "James," Cora said. "James Elias Holloway." He sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby with those amber eyes, and he reached out one large, scarred, careful hand and let the baby's fingers close around his smallest finger with the reflex grip of the newborn, and he said nothing for a long time because there was nothing to say that would have been sufficient. "James Elias Wallace Holloway," he said finally, looking at her. She smiled. "All the names." "All the names," he agreed. Little James Wallace Holloway grew up on the land that bore half his name, in the cabin his great-grandfather in legacy had built along the cottonwood-lined creek, with a father who taught him to track and to read mountains, and to treat the land with the respect of someone who understood that he was part of it rather than the owner of it, and a mother who taught him mathematics and law and the importance of knowing the precise ordinance when someone tries to take what is yours. He learned to ride before he could properly walk and to read before he started school, and he had his mother's sage-green eyes and his father's broad-shouldered frame beginning to show even in childhood. And when strangers came through the valley and asked his name, he said it with all four parts, clear and proud, the way his parents had always said theirs. By the time James was 3, the Wallace Creek quarter had grown. Cora had bought the adjacent 20 acres from a homesteader who was moving north, expanding the southern pasture and giving them room for a larger cattle operation. They had built a second room onto the cabin, not a grand addition, but solid and well done. Elias working with Amos Birch through the summer to get it up before another winter. And the barn they put up the following year was the kind of structure that makes people stop and look when they pass, because it was built by a man who had been building in mountain country for 15 years and understood that a structure is only as good as what it can withstand. There was another child in 1884, a girl they named Clara Josephine Holloway, who arrived in August on a day of perfect summer light and immediately displayed a personality that suggested the Wallace stubbornness had skipped James entirely and concentrated itself in her second-chance arrival. She was opinionated before she was verbal and formidably articulate once she achieved language, and both her parents regarded her with the mixed pride and mild alarm that is the appropriate response to raising a person who is clearly going to give the world a great deal to think about. In 1885, Garrett Sully finally left Dry Creek under circumstances that were not entirely dignified. A territorial audit of several land transactions had turned up irregularities that predated Cora's claim by several years, and the sheriff's office had taken an interest, and Sully had decided that Cheyenne offered better prospects. Nobody in Dry Creek seemed particularly saddened by this development. Cora sat at her father's table on her father's land on the evening she heard the news, and she thought about the notice on the post outside the general store, and the timing that had been so close it had almost broken her, and the fact that she had been exactly 29 days inside the window rather than outside it, and she thought that the world contained enough justice in it to be worth fighting for, even if it did not contain so much that you could afford to stop fighting. She wrote an account of the land claim dispute and its resolution for the Cheyenne newspaper, which published it in a series of 2 pieces in the spring of 1886 under the title, A Woman's Right and a Territorial Ordinance. The pieces were read by enough people in enough places to generate correspondence, other women in similar situations, other heirs facing similar challenges, other people who had needed the precise paragraph of the exact ordinance and had not known how to find it. She answered every letter personally, with the relevant documentation, in the clear and precise prose that had always been her strength. Elias read the published pieces at the breakfast table and looked at her over the top of the newspaper with those amber eyes warm and certain. "Your father would have framed these," he said. "I know," she said. He folded the newspaper carefully and set it on the shelf next to the framed photograph and the row of books and the leather journal, which was where it stayed. The years moved through them, and they moved through the years, and the land grew around their lives the way land does when people care for it well, not dramatically, not with sudden transformation, but with the steady accumulation of effort and attention and love, the kind that takes a long time to see but is unmistakable once you stand back far enough to take in the whole of it. The cottonwoods her father had planted along the fence line grew tall enough to be visible from the upper trail. The cattle herd increased, and then, when the market shifted, decreased, and then increased again in a different proportion of breeds that Elias had researched with the same thoroughness he brought to his trapping roots. The garden expanded and was joined by a small orchard of apple trees on the eastern slope that took years to bear fruit, but then bore it generously. Dry Creek itself grew and changed around them. A school appeared, finally, in 1882, and a proper doctor's office, and the church got its walls and eventually its roof, and the railroad came through a town 30 miles south that drew off some of the population but also brought new people and new business. The saloons were still there, and so was the livery and the general store, now under new ownership, and Mrs. Crane's boarding house ran until 1887, when Elspeth Crane passed away at an age. She had always refused to specify and left the building to her nephew in Laramie, who turned it into a hotel that was less comfortable and smelled more of pipe smoke. Elias still made his runs into the high country, but less frequently as the years passed, not because the mountains had stopped calling, but because the valley had claimed a greater portion of him, because his children called him in from the barn in voices that pulled at something older and deeper than any mountain could reach. He was the kind of father who taught by example and presence, who fixed things when they broke and sat with his children when they were afraid and worked beside them when they were capable, and never needed to raise his voice, because his steadiness was its own authority. Cora was the kind of mother who taught her children that the world was full of ordinances, and that knowing the right one at the right time was a form of power available to anyone willing to study. She was also the kind of mother who told stories in the evenings, some from books and some from memory, and some she made up from the landscape around them, and her children sat close and listened with the particular quality of attention that means a person is not just hearing but storing, putting the words somewhere deep where they will remain useful. On an evening in the fall of 1887, 8 years after the morning she had ridden into Dry Creek on a cracked-heeled boot, and a purpose she had been afraid was too late. Cora Wallace Holloway sat on the porch of her father's cabin, her family's cabin, and watched the sun go down behind the Wind River Range in the particular way it did in October, turning the whole western sky the color of embers, and listened to the sound of her husband splitting wood at the barn and her son, James, arguing with her daughter Clara about something she could not quite hear, and felt the unmistakable sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be, living exactly the life she was supposed to be living. Elias came up from the barn with the axe over his shoulder, tall and broad and still, at 36, as physically overwhelming as he had been the day she had walked into him on the street, though now she understood his size in the context of his gentleness, and it was simply part of how he was shaped, inside and out. He saw her on the porch and changed his direction toward her, the way he always did, because coming home meant coming to where she was. He leaned the axe against the porch railing and sat on the step beside her, and she leaned against his shoulder the way she had learned to years ago, the way that was as natural now as breathing, and they watched the sky together. "James has been asking about going up to the high cabin this winter," Elias said. "He wants to learn the trapping routes." "He is 7, Cora said. "I was younger than that when I started learning the mountains," Elias said. "You are not the standard by which most people measure childhood experience," she said. He made a low sound of amusement. "He is ready for more than we are giving him." She considered this with the fairness she applied to all things. "Next spring," she said, "when the passes are open and the snow is safe, you can take him up to the high cabin and spend a week." "He will be beside himself," Elias said. "He will," she agreed. "Clara will be beside herself with indignation at not being included. Clara can come the following year. You had better tell Clara that before James tells her in whatever way will cause the most drama." He laughed, and she felt the sound of it against her shoulder, and the mountains were turning purple in the failing light, and the stars were beginning to appear in the east, and the creek ran its cold, clear running sound that she had been listening to for 8 years and had still not gotten used to. Not the way you stop noticing something, but the way you keep noticing it because it is part of what you are grateful for. "Elias," she said. "Huh?" he said in the way that meant he was listening fully while watching the sky. "Thank you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "For what specifically?" "For saying my name right," she said. "That first time, and every time since." She felt him turn his head to look at her, though she did not look up from the mountains. She could feel the amber warmth of his attention the same way she could feel the last warmth of the sun. "Cora Wallace Holloway," he said, and each name had its full weight, all 4 syllables of it, the Wallace given its proper place in the middle where it would always remain, neither a footnote nor a replacement but the core of the whole thing, the evidence of the man who had planted cottonwoods along a fence line and hoped his daughter would come to find them waiting. She turned and looked at her husband in the last light of a Wyoming fall, and he was looking at her with everything he was, without reservation, the way he had been looking at her for 8 years. And she thought that this was what it meant to have your name said with respect, not just the syllables of it, but the whole story the name contained, heard and honored by someone who understood that a name was not just a sound but a history and a right and a belonging. "Come inside," she said. "Supper." He stood and offered her his hand, that large scarred hand that had fixed her roof and held her father's memory, and delivered their children into the world, and split an impractical quantity of firewood, and pressed her own hands to his lips on a December night when he had told her she deserved everything done right, and she took it the way she always did, completely. They went inside together into the warm light of the cabin, where James and Clara were loudly resolving their argument at the table, and the stove was burning, and the shelf held its row of books, and the photograph, and the journal that said the land was hers, and the name belonged on this earth the same as the creek did. And it did, and it always would.